This isn't just the story of mysterious lights over Brazil. It's the story of an entire town that believed it was under attack. Doctors documented unexplained injuries. Families became too afraid to leave their homes after dark. The mayor pleaded for help. Eventually, the Brazilian Air Force launched an official investigation. Nearly 50 years later, many of the questions remain unanswered. In 1977, the isolated community of Colares, Brazil, was much like countless other villages scattered across the Amazon Delta. Life revolved around fishing. Families knew one another. Nights were quiet, broken only by the sounds of insects, river water, and the movement of boats returning from the sea. But sometime that year, strange lights began appearing over the water. At first, no one was afraid. The glowing objects hovered silently in the distance, shining red, orange, yellow, and green. Fishermen watched from their boats. Villagers gathered outside to look toward the sky. Many believed they were witnessing something strange, but harmless. Maybe even beautiful. No one could have imagined those same lights would soon plunge the entire community into fear. At first, the strange lights remained little more than a mystery. Fishermen watched them from their boats as glowing orbs drifted silently over the water. Night after night, the lights returned. Never made a sound. They didn't appear to threaten anyone. They simply hovered in the distance before disappearing back into the darkness. Word spread quickly across Colares. Families began gathering outside after sunset, pointing toward the sky as the glowing objects appeared once again. Some described brilliant red lights, others reported orange, yellow, and green. A few witnesses claimed the objects looked less like balls of light and more like solid craft moving in ways no conventional aircraft could. Whatever they were, they seemed almost curious. For a brief moment, many residents believed they were witnessing something extraordinary. Some even described the lights as beautiful, but that sense of wonder wouldn't last. Then, everything changed. The lights had quietly drifted above the village were no longer content to remain in the distance. They began flying lower, hovering over rooftops, following fishermen back to shore, and sometimes descending towards people on the ground. Witnesses described narrow beams of light suddenly shooting from the objects. Those struck by the beams reported an intense burning sensation. Some collapsed where they stood. Others said they couldn't move, completely awake, but unable to control their bodies as the glowing objects hovered silently overhead. When the encounters ended, many discovered strange puncture marks on their skin. Some became dizzy, weak, and unusually pale for days afterward. As similar attacks were reported across the island, residents began to believe the lights weren't simply observing them. They believed they were being hunted. The mysterious objects soon earned a terrifying nickname, Chupa Chupa, the sucker. As the attacks continued, fear spread rapidly through Colares. Families stopped leaving their homes after sunset. Fishermen whose livelihoods depended on the night became increasingly reluctant to venture out onto the water. Many residents gathered together after dark, believing there was safety in numbers. Some carried flashlights, others lit large fires, and many believed loud noises might drive the mysterious lights away. Yet despite these efforts, reports of new encounters continued almost every night. The growing panic soon overwhelmed the small island community. Before long, frightened residents began seeking help from the only person they believed could help explain what was happening: the town's physician, Dr. Walaide Sesim Carvalho. The growing number of reports soon brought frightened residents to the office of the town's physician, Dr. Carvalho. At first, she searched for ordinary explanations: fear, stress, even the possibility that panic itself was contributing to what people believed they had experienced. But as more patients arrived, she began noticing something difficult to ignore. Many described remarkably similar encounters. They spoke of sudden beams of light, a burning sensation, weakness that lingered for days, and small, unusual puncture marks on their bodies. Dr. Carvalho documented the injuries she observed, later stating that many of the patients showed physical symptoms she struggled to explain through conventional medicine alone. Whatever was happening in Colares, it was no longer just a collection of frightening stories. As the weeks passed, reports of the mysterious lights continued to spread across Colares and neighboring communities. Local officials found themselves overwhelmed by the growing number of witnesses, injuries, and increasingly desperate requests for help. Newspapers across northern Brazil began covering the strange events, and concern quickly spread beyond the island itself. By the fall of 1977, the situation had drawn the attention of Brazil's military government. The Brazilian Air Force dispatched a team of investigators to the region under a classified mission known as Operação Prato. Led by Captain Uyrangê Hollanda, the team established a base of operations in Colares and began interviewing witnesses, photographing reported phenomena, and documenting every new report they could verify. What followed would become one of the most thoroughly documented official investigations of unidentified aerial phenomena ever conducted. But the files they created would remain hidden from the public for decades. Once Operation Prato was underway, the military team did more than collect stories from frightened residents. Investigators established observation points across Colares and the surrounding communities, recording the time, direction, altitude, color, speed, and apparent size of the lights they witnessed. The surviving records describe objects moving silently over beaches and waterways, sometimes glowing red or yellow, sometimes flashing an intense blue. Some followed straight paths, others changed speed, made abrupt turns, hovered over the shoreline, or disappeared beyond the trees. In several reports, investigators openly marked distant lights as probable satellites, but other observations were harder to explain. One record describes a yellow light traveling overhead before suddenly making a 90-degree turn. Another describes a stationary blue-violet light near the water, its reflection creating the impression that it was changing size. According to later accounts of the operation, members of the team witnessed the phenomenon themselves and produced photographs, sketches, maps, and hours of film. What had begun as testimony from isolated villagers was becoming something else. A structured military record of repeated, unexplained events. At first, many of the men involved still believed the sightings would eventually have a conventional explanation. To cover more ground, the team divided into separate groups and established observation points across the region. They watched from beaches, roads, riverbanks, and isolated communities, often remaining in position for hours at a time. But the longer the operation continued, the harder it became to dismiss what local residents had been reporting. Members of the team began witnessing the lights themselves. They described objects moving silently over the water and treetops, changing direction, slowing near observation points, and disappearing with unusual speed. These were no longer secondhand stories from frightened villagers. The men sent to investigate the phenomenon were now observing it firsthand. Their initial skepticism began to fade. Information was passed back through the chain of command, making it clear that the team had not found a simple explanation for what was happening over Colares. What began as an effort to calm the population had now become something far more serious. The investigators were no longer asking whether the phenomenon was real, they were trying to understand what it was. The message sent back through the chain of command changed the direction of the investigation. The team could no longer dismiss the sightings as panic, rumor, or the misidentification of ordinary aircraft. Their own personnel had observed objects they could not explain. The operation was reinforced. Agents from Brazil's National Information Service joined the Air Force team, bringing additional personnel and access to better equipment. The investigators began using more advanced cameras, including Super 8 film, as the observation effort spread across the region. The sightings continued week after week. Military personnel and intelligence agents now reported their own encounters with strange lights moving above the forests, rivers, and coastal communities. The phenomenon appeared across multiple observation areas rather than remaining confined to one location. According to the accounts preserved in the investigation, some of the team's encounters occurred at surprisingly close range. At the same time, villagers continued reporting that the activity was moving nearer to their homes, and in some cases that strange beings had entered them. The investigation had now moved far beyond the original reports from Colares. More personnel were involved, more locations were being watched, and higher-ranking officers were beginning to take notice. Captain Hollanda would go on to have an encounter himself. Captain Hollanda claimed that the phenomenon eventually confronted him directly. According to his later account, he was lying on his side when a powerful flash suddenly filled the room. Startled, he heard something unusual behind him. Then he said a being wrapped its arms around him. Hollanda described it as roughly 1.5 meters tall, wearing a loose suit that reminded him of an astronaut's uniform or a diving suit. He said the figure wore a gray mask that concealed its face. He could not make out any eyes or recognizable facial features. Frightened, Hollanda said he felt the being holding and squeezing him from behind. Then it spoke directly into his ears. The words were Portuguese, but the voice did not sound human. Hollanda compared it to a computer, metallic, artificial, and strangely mechanical. According to him, the message was simple: take it easy, we aren't going to do you any harm. For Hollanda, this was no longer an observation of distant lights over the Amazon. It was a close physical encounter that he said remained with him for the rest of his life. Whether interpreted as a literal encounter, an altered experience, or something still unexplained, Hollanda's account became one of the most extraordinary claims ever made by the commander of an official military investigation into unexplained aerial phenomena. Hollanda's alleged encounter marked a disturbing turning point in the operation. What had begun with reports from frightened villagers had now reached the officer commanding the investigation itself. Hollanda later claimed that the phenomenon had entered his private space, physically restrained him, and spoke directly into his ear. Not long afterward, the operation was brought to an end. Brigadier General Protasio Lopez de Oliveira ordered the team to stop its field investigation and assemble everything it had collected. Some researchers later speculated that outside pressure influenced the decision, including possible involvement by American officials, but Hollanda's surviving account does not conclusively establish that. The team gathered its observations into a massive final record. According to the notes surrounding the case, the completed material exceeded 1,000 pages and included witness testimony, maps, sketches, photographs, film, and detailed accounts from military personnel who had observed the phenomenon themselves. Yet the explanation eventually presented to the public was far less extraordinary. The incidents were officially dismissed as optical illusions, hallucinations, and panic created by mass hysteria. The conclusion stood in sharp contrast to what the investigation team had privately recorded. The men sent to disapprove the stories had reported objects they could not identify. Their photographs, films, and reports were forwarded through military channels and then largely disappeared from public view. For decades, Operation Prato remained buried inside Brazilian government archives, but the witnesses had not forgotten, and eventually some of the files and one of the men who created them would emerge. Although Operation Prato had officially ended, the events in Colares did not simply disappear. Over the following years, independent researchers began traveling to the region, interviewing witnesses, examining medical accounts, and attempting to reconstruct what had happened during the 1977 wave. American journalist Bob Pratt became one of the most persistent investigators of the case. He collected testimony from residents who said they had been struck by beams of light, left weakened, burned, or marked by small puncture-like injuries. French researcher Jacques Vallée also examined the Colares report. After reviewing witness accounts and the descriptions of the physical injuries, Vallée argued that some of the effects resembled exposure to concentrated microwave energy. It was his interpretation, not an official medical conclusion, but it offered a possible mechanism for the injuries the witnesses insisted were real. Brazilian UFO researchers continued pressing the government for answers. They gathered leaked documents, tracked down former personnel, and kept Operation Prato alive long after the Air Force had declared the matter closed. Gradually, fragments of the investigation began surfacing: photographs, maps, sketches, and classified reports bearing the markings of the Brazilian military. The emerging documents confirmed that the Air Force had conducted a serious field investigation far larger than the public had originally been told. But the most important testimony had not yet appeared. 20 years after the operation ended, Captain Uyrangê Hollanda would finally break his silence. In 1997, nearly 20 years after Operation Prato, Captain Uyrangê Hollanda finally began speaking publicly about what his team had experienced. Hollanda said the investigators had arrived skeptical. At first, they expected to find ordinary aircraft, natural phenomenon, or frightened residents misinterpreting lights in the sky. But according to him, the skepticism did not survive the investigation. He claimed that members of the team witnessed the objects themselves, sometimes at close range, and recorded events they could not explain through conventional means. Hollanda also described a sharp divide between what was happening privately and what the public was being told. While the military continued observing, photographing, and filming the phenomenon, local residents were encouraged to believe that fear and imagination were responsible. He said Dr. Walaide was pressured to calm the population and suggest the witnesses were mistaken or simply becoming hysterical. Hollanda maintained the surviving files represented only part of what Operation Prato had collected. He spoke of additional photographs, film, reports, and testimony that had never been shown publicly. His interviews transformed the case. For the first time, the commander of the investigation was openly stating that the Air Force team had encountered something it could not identify. But Hollanda would not have long to tell his story. Only months after speaking publicly, he was found dead, an event that would add another disturbing layer of mystery to Operation Prato. In October 1997, only months after giving his most detailed interviews, Captain Uyrangê Hollanda died by suicide. The timing immediately fueled speculation. Some within the UFO community believed his death was connected to his decision to speak publicly. Others suggested that he revealed information the military never intended to become public. But no evidence has ever established that Hollanda was silenced, threatened, or killed because of his testimony. The circumstances surrounding his death remain tragic, and the connection to Operation Prato remains speculation. His interviews, however, ensured that the investigation could no longer be forgotten. Brazilian researchers continued demanding access to the files. Years later, after sustained public pressure, portions of Operation Prato archive were finally released. The documents confirmed that this had never been a brief inquiry into village superstition. The Brazilian Air Force had deployed personnel, established observation posts, interviewed witnesses, produced maps and sketches, and collected photographs and film while investigating unexplained activity across the region. Yet even the released material may represent only part of the original archive. Nearly half a century later, no single explanation accounts for every report, injury, military observation, or documented connected to Colares. Perhaps the witnesses misunderstood what they saw. Perhaps fear transformed ordinary events into something extraordinary. Or perhaps during those months in 1977, something genuinely unknown moved through the skies over northern Brazil. Whatever the truth may be, the people of Colares lived through it, the Brazilian Air Force investigated it, and the mystery of Operation Prato remains.